My name is Larissa Mendez. If my testimony touches your heart, please comment below where you're watching from and leave a message. I'll read each one with care. It all started very early. People always said I was a blessed child, raised in the fear of God, in a home where faith wasn't just a pillar, it was the very roof under which we lived. My mother, Dona Marta, was a woman of prayer. She would rise before the sun, her knees marked by time, always bowed before the Word, praying for blessings and protection over our family. To her, the world outside was full of temptation, and the only safe path was one of unquestioning obedience to the Bible, and especially to those who spoke in the name of God. My father, Seu Armando, was a reserved man. He was physically present, but emotionally absent. His voice was always low and firm, and it allowed no reply. He believed children should listen, lower their heads, and obey. Affection wasn't part of his vocabulary, but discipline, that he knew well. He was a guardian of order and silence. In my childhood, our routine was almost sacred. Wake up, pray, study, pray again, help around the house, pray some more, go to church, return, and thank God for everything. Even when I didn't fully understand what that everything was. On Sundays, I'd wear my simple long dress, my hair neatly combed and tied up. We'd walk into the church in silence. My mother with her head held high, my father with a stern face, and me with a tight, anxious heart, wanting only to please. From an early age, I learned to admire the church leaders. Not by choice but because I was taught they were untouchable, men and women chosen by God, above all fault. And among all of them, one name stood out. Pastor Roberto. Tall with a commanding presence and a constant smile, he spoke with both authority and gentleness. Everyone stopped to listen when he spoke. When he stepped up to the pulpit, silence fell over the room. His sermons were moving, his words seemed to come straight from heaven. The women said he was a man of God. The men respected him as a true shepherd, blameless, flawless. My mother, especially, revered him. She always said, if you ever want to understand what it means to walk with God, watch Pastor Roberto. And so I watched. He seemed perfect. Always available to listen, to counsel, to pray. The Sunday services were just the beginning. During the week, there were teaching services, morning prayers, vigils. And at every single one of them, Pastor Roberto was there, strong and present. I remember how, on many of those nights, I would watch the church's comings and goings. People arrived with tired eyes and left, renewed. At least, that's what they said. I often left confused. I remember a moment in my childhood when I asked my mother, innocently, "Mom, what if the pastor makes a mistake? Who corrects him?" She looked at me sternly and said, "It's not for us to judge the Lord's anointed. God will correct him at the right time." That look, so firm and severe, silenced me. I never dared question anything again. In Sunday school, I was the model student. I memorized every verse, made the longest and most beautiful prayers, always praised by the teachers, and sometimes even by the pastor himself. I felt proud when I saw the glow in my mother's eyes. Being good at church meant being good for God. And being good for God was, to me, the only way to be loved. But even as a child, I felt a heaviness in my heart. A constant fear of making a mistake, of not being obedient enough, of disappointing not just my parents, but God too. There was a strange silence inside me, as if I had to suffocate my doubts, my wants, my thoughts. The environment was built to shape obedient people. Questioning was seen as rebellion. I remember an episode in the children's class when my friend Isabella asked if people from other religions also went to heaven. The teacher widened her eyes and in a harsh tone, said, "Don't ask questions like that. The Lord is saddened by foolish doubts." Isabella cried, and I learned right then that asking questions could bring shame. As I grew, I carefully observed every move of the leaders. Pastor Roberto was the ultimate example. He had a wife, Sister Sylvia, who always seemed very quiet, submissive, almost invisible. I didn't see her smile much. Always beside him in silence, confirming everything with a nod. Special events, like vigils and spiritual retreats, were moments eagerly awaited. It was during these gatherings that the pastor ministered more closely. Mothers encouraged their daughters to be noticed, to participate, to stand out. The closer to the altar, the closer to God's heart, my mother would say. And I, with all my innocence, obeyed. I would spend hours reading the Bible, writing down verses in colorful notebooks, drawing pictures of passages that touched me. My bedroom had a framed verse on the wall that read, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls." Below it, a handwritten dedication from my mother, "Daughter, always be obedient. The Lord sees your heart." Time passed, and I became the daughter everyone expected. Quiet, dedicated, devout. Other girls would say how lucky my mother was to have such a well-behaved daughter. And I wore that like a crown, but also like a burden. There was no room for doubt. As the years went by, I began to notice things I didn't know how to name. Small gestures, lingering looks, words that made me uncomfortable but that I swallowed, because in my mind, they were blessings in disguise. And so I continued, obeying, staying silent, wishing to be perfect. Because that was what I had always been taught, to be obedient above all else. Never to question. Adolescence came like a quiet breeze, and before I knew it, I was no longer the shy little girl from Sunday school. Slowly, I began to take on a greater role in the church, something my mother saw as a great sign of honor and spiritual promise. She would say God had big plans for me, and I wanted to believe that with all my heart. I began to participate actively in the youth group, in worship rehearsals, in prayer campaigns that went on into the early morning. It was exhausting, but I felt a strange sense of pride. I felt like I was pleasing God and by extension, pleasing my mother, my family, and especially Pastor Roberto. He would always say in front of everyone, "The youth are the future of the church, and among them, God chooses precious vessels." It was around this time that Julia became a special part of my life. We were the same age, had the same responsibilities in church, and quickly became best friends. Julia was sweet, always smiling, but I noticed, during our more private conversations, that she also carried a weight she couldn't name. Just like me, she lived to obey. Her mother, also fervent, always taught her to serve, to be available, to never question. Our Sundays were long. We'd start with morning service, then go to a shared lunch at a church member's house, and in the afternoon, straight to choir or theater practice, followed by evening service. And there, in that environment so full of rules disguised as love, I began to notice Pastor Roberto's gaze. He watched me closely. At first, I thought it was just admiration for my dedication. Then came the public praise. "This young woman has a spark in her eyes. The Lord has something great in store for her." My heart would race. I felt proud, but at the same time, a strange chill ran down my spine. It was like I was afraid of not living up to what they expected of me. One night after a vigil, he approached me, gently placed his hand on my shoulder, and said with a calm smile, "You have a special calling, Larissa. The Lord revealed it to me." I smiled shyly, not knowing what to say. The word calling sounded so big, so distant. But coming from him, I didn't dare doubt it. From that day on, my mother started looking at me differently. She said I needed to consecrate myself even more, that I should fast, pray more, watch every word I spoke. The weight of spiritual responsibility is for the few, my daughter. And you were chosen. Pastor Roberto began to approach me more often. At first, it was just quick conversations after church, a greeting, a compliment. Then he started calling me for special guidance. He said he needed to prepare me, that God had something very serious in store for me, and that I couldn't walk this path alone. I felt important. I saw the pride in my mother grow, and even my father, always so cold, began to look at me with more approval. At home, everything revolved around my supposed calling. My sisters were instructed to help more with the chores so I could dedicate more time to prayer and Bible study. Julia noticed everything. During our talks, she would say, "The pastor really trusts you, Laurie. That's amazing." But at the same time, her expression showed concern. One time, while we were having ice cream after choir practice, she asked me, "Don't you ever feel too pressured?" I laughed and brushed it off. I said it was a blessing, that I should be happy. She nodded, but her eyes said something else. The private guidance started off gently. Quick meetings after service, specific prayers, advice on how to be a pure and obedient young woman. But little by little, those meetings started happening at odd hours, outside the regular church routine. He said it was necessary for a deeper discipleship, away from distractions, where God could speak more intimately. I felt proud. I felt afraid. A confusing mix. What I knew for sure was that I could never disappoint that man, whom everyone said was the voice of God in our church. Pastor Roberto spoke beautiful words that made me believe I was different. God chose you, daughter. Don't let the world distract you from your purpose. I'm here to guide you. And I accepted everything without question. At home, my mother would constantly remind me, "Be strong, Larissa. The enemy tries to bring down the chosen ones. Don't let your guard down." I felt suffocated, yet powerless to escape it. It was as if my entire life was being built around a destiny already decided by others. The meetings started becoming more frequent. Always in the name of a greater calling. Always with sweet words and praise that left me speechless. And the fear grew. Silent, shapeless. I didn't know if I was afraid of him, of disappointing him, or of God, who maybe really was asking me for something greater than I could bear. Julia, little by little, became quieter. Sometimes she seemed like she wanted to tell me something but stopped mid-sentence. One day after a vigil she told me, "Larissa, if one day you feel like something is wrong, trust your heart." I didn't understand. And she just smiled. That sad smile I would only come to understand much later. At that time, I still believed that all of this was part of God's plan. That I really was chosen. I just didn't know yet what price that would carry. The private guidance sessions soon became a fixed part of my routine. At first, they were short meetings at church, but then Pastor Roberto started scheduling one-on-one sessions in his office, away from everyone's eyes. Always with the same speech. "We need to pray in private, Larissa. God wants to reveal deep things to you." Raised to obey without question, I felt my heart tighten, but I never dared to doubt. After all, he was the man of God. The first time I was alone with him in the pastor's office, I remember how my stomach turned. He smiled with the same gentle expression as always and asked me to sit down. On the desk, there was an open Bible, a steaming mug of coffee, and an atmosphere that, somehow, felt suffocating. He began with sweet words. "Larissa, you have no idea how much God has chosen you. There's a great purpose over your life. But for that, you must be molded, refined, spiritually prepared." I listened silently, absorbing every word. I felt both proud and afraid. Then he came a little closer. He placed his hand on my head and began to pray. His hand moved down to my shoulder, gently pressing it. Then, his fingers slowly traced down my arm, a subtle touch that gave me chills, but not in a good way. I didn't know how to react. It didn't feel right, but what if it was just a spiritual gesture of affection? Maybe the problem was me, misinterpreting things? After the prayer, he looked into my eyes and said, "Never let the enemy plant doubt in your heart. The Lord works in ways we don't always understand." I nodded silently, swallowing the discomfort. The following weeks became a repetition of that same ritual. Private meetings, long prayers, motivational words, and touches that left me confused. One day he held my face in both hands and said, "You are precious to God, and to me as well." My heart raced, but I just gave a nervous smile. I left there with shaky legs and a mind full of thoughts I couldn't organize. Pastor Roberto's wife, Sylvia, began to intrigue me. Always so quiet, always a step behind him. In every service, she sat beside the pulpit, staring into the void. I tried to find something in her eyes, a sign, an expression that told me she noticed. But Sylvia seemed like a living ghost, present and absent at the same time. There was something about that woman that unsettled me. How could someone live so close to him and not notice anything? Or did she? I became more introspective. At home, my mother thought it was a sign of spiritual growth. "The Lord is shaping you," she'd say, pleased. But I felt a weight, a suffocating silence. It was one of those nights, after choir rehearsal, that Julia pulled me aside. She looked nervous, her eyes restless. "Laurie, can I tell you something?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I nodded. She took a deep breath and said, I don't feel comfortable with the way the pastor talks to me sometimes. And when he touches me, I don't know. I get this chill in my stomach. That's not normal, right? I felt a lump in my throat. It was as if she had finally put into words everything I had been feeling but didn't have the courage to admit. I looked at her, trying to stay calm. "Do you think we're imagining it?" I asked, almost hoping she'd say yes. But Julia shook her head. "I don't know, Laurie. All I know is that sometimes I just want to disappear. But I'm scared to say anything and be punished. What if it's the enemy trying to confuse us?" That doubt ate away at us from the inside. The line between right and wrong, between spiritual and abusive, was completely blurred. We were taught not to doubt, not to question, to accept. And now we were there, full of fear and guilt, unsure whether the problem was the pastor, or our weak faith. I began to avoid being alone with him, but it wasn't easy. He always found a way to call me. And when he didn't, he would look at me from afar, as if to remind me of the commitment I had to that calling. The nights became longer. I would pray, cry, and beg God to show me if I was wrong for thinking these things. But silence was the only answer I received. And I remained trapped, between devotion and fear. The spiritual retreat was the most anticipated event of the year. Young people from several churches gathered at a secluded countryside site for 3 days dedicated entirely to prayer, worship, and consecration. My mother hugged me before I got on the bus, teary-eyed. "Daughter, enjoy every second. God is going to speak to you in a special way." I wanted to believe that, but deep down, a persistent uneasiness followed me. The first 2 days were intense. Long services, overnight vigils, group fasts. I participated in everything, wanting to be seen, to be approved, by God, by the leaders, by Pastor Roberto. He was always there, watching, smiling, placing his hand on the shoulders of the young people, especially mine. With every touch, the pit in my stomach grew, but I suppressed the discomfort with the excuse I had always been taught. "He's a man of God. I'm being blessed." On the last night of the retreat, after the service, he called me aside discreetly. "Larissa, I need to pray for you in private. God has something urgent to reveal to you. We can't wait." I hesitated, but he smiled and said, "Don't be afraid. This is part of God's plan." He took me to a small cabin, away from the lodging area. The lights were off, and only the moonlight came through the window. He asked me to kneel and began to pray aloud, strong words, asking God to free me from invisible chains, to prepare me for the ministry to come. In the middle of the prayer, I felt his hands gripping my shoulders, then slowly sliding down my arms. My heart raced. I was trembling. I wanted to get up to leave, but my mind screamed, "Stay! Don't disobey." Then came the most invasive touch. An affection that crossed the line. A contact that made me shrink, freeze, unable to react. I wanted to cry, to scream, but he whispered in my ear, "Daughter, this is part of God's plan. Don't be afraid. You are chosen. But you must keep this a secret. If you speak, you may disrupt the mission the Lord has for you." Tears fell, but I didn't dare say a word. I felt dirty, guilty, confused. I left the cabin with trembling legs, my face burning with shame, and my soul heavy. I stayed up all night, staring at the ceiling, asking God if this was really what He wanted for me. I came back from the retreat changed. At home, my mother noticed my silence and only said, "The Lord is shaping you." The cycle of guilt and fear had fully taken hold. I felt unworthy, sinful. How could I dare question the man that everyone revered? Maybe I had misinterpreted everything. Maybe it was the enemy trying to confuse my mind. Julia, who had always been my confidant, began to distance herself. She avoided me during rehearsals, replied to my messages curtly. Until one day, I went to her house, and her mother handed me an envelope. "She asked me to give you this." It was a letter. With trembling hands, I read, "Laurie, I tried to be strong, but I couldn't. I don't know what's happening to you, but I know what happened to me. This isn't God. This isn't His plan. It's abuse. Be careful. Please, don't be alone with him. I can't take it anymore and I'm leaving. I hope you find the courage. I love you. Julia." Tears stained the paper. I knew in that moment that I wasn't crazy. It wasn't all in my head. It wasn't the enemy. It was real. And it was happening to me. But even knowing that, I didn't know how to escape. I felt trapped, suffocated, with no way out. Because, to me, speaking up meant interrupting a divine plan. And staying silent meant dying inside. The days that followed the retreat felt like a weight I could barely carry. I walked through life like a shadow of who I used to be. The smile that once lit up my face had become a tense, silent mask. My eyes, which once looked to the heavens with hope, now only saw the ground, heavy with shame, fear, and guilt. With every step, I felt as if I were carrying an invisible burden, a weight pressing down on my shoulders and my soul, choking out any possibility of lightness. The hardest part was living with the feeling that it was all my fault. I kept asking myself what I had done to deserve it. Maybe I had given the wrong signals. Maybe my smile had been inappropriate, or my words careless. My mind was a dark maze where thoughts struck me without mercy. Every memory of that night in the cabin felt like a blade slicing my skin from the inside. And the more I tried to erase it from memory, the more vivid the scene became, as if it were tattooed on my consciousness. The church, which once had been my refuge, had become a minefield. The walls that used to embrace me now seemed to watch me, silently judging. The words of the sermons, which once brought peace, now wounded me. When Pastor Roberto stood at the pulpit and spoke of purity, obedience, and holiness, I felt a lump in my throat and an almost uncontrollable urge to run. But I stayed. I always stayed. Held back by fear, guilt, and the belief that this was a burden I had to bear to please God. My mental health began to collapse slowly and relentlessly. Sleep abandoned me. The nights were long, accompanied by dark, suffocating thoughts. Questions without answers hammered endlessly in my mind. Why me? What did I do wrong? Does God hate me? Am I being punished for some hidden sin? Bit by bit, I started to imagine what it would be like to just disappear. There were moments when I looked out the window of my room and thought that if I were no longer here, everything would be easier for everyone. But the fear of hell was stronger. I had been taught from a young age that taking one's own life was an unforgivable sin. So I died while alive, slowly, without the courage to end it all, but without the strength to keep going. The anguish was constant, a suffocating presence that followed me in every gesture, every word, every breath. At home, my relationship with my family deteriorated. My mother, blinded by devotion and pride in having a chosen daughter, didn't see the abyss I was drowning in. On the rare occasions I tried to show any vulnerability, she would simply say, "Be strong, Larissa. God is shaping you. The chosen go through hard trials." These words, which were supposed to comfort me, only crushed me more. It was as if my pain was invalid, reduced to the whim of a weak faith. My father remained distant, rigid, more concerned with the family's image than with the state of my soul. Gradually, I completely isolated myself. I stopped talking to my friends, avoided youth group gatherings, started arriving late to services and leaving before the end. But still I couldn't escape. Pastor Roberto's gaze followed me. Always watchful, always present, always reminding me, even without words, that I shouldn't say anything. That this divine plan depended on my silence. It was in that dark place that Daniel appeared. A young man new to the church, recently arrived from another city, with a different look in his eyes. Not the judgmental rule-filled stare I was used to, but a sincere, curious and gentle gaze. Daniel stood out for his kindness, his easy smile, and the calm way he treated everyone. It was obvious how untouched he seemed by the stifling weight of the expectations and judgments that the church carried. At first, I barely noticed him. I was too absorbed in my own world of guilt and fear. But Daniel began to notice my silence, my withdrawal. Always gently, he tried to include me in conversations, invited me to rehearsals, asked simple questions, as if he were trying to open small windows of light into my dark world. I avoided it. I answered in monosyllables, looked away, walked off. Even so, he persisted, respectfully. He didn't invade my space, but made it clear he could see something wasn't right. One day, after a service, he found me in the hallway and softly said, "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Those words echoed in my mind for days, but the fear was greater. How could I trust anyone? How could I speak, if I couldn't even confess to myself what I felt? The thought of telling someone the truth terrified me. What if no one believed me? What if they thought I was trying to tarnish the name of a man of God? Worse, what if my own mother called me ungrateful, rebellious, a tool of the enemy? No, I couldn't risk that. It felt safer to remain silent, even if that silence was killing me little by little. The weeks went by, and I felt weaker with each passing day. My body started to show signs of collapse. Constant headaches, nausea, loss of appetite, insomnia. The deep circles under my eyes betrayed my sleepless nights. At school, my performance plummeted. The teachers commented on how I'd changed, but I just gave a mechanical smile and kept going. The church remained the same, full of smiles, fake hugs, and rehearsed words. Pastor Roberto continued at the pulpit, hailed as a man of God, while I struggled not to fall apart completely. During services, I sat farther and farther toward the back, avoiding being called to the front. But even so, from time to time, he would throw glances at me that froze me in place, a silent reminder that my silence was expected. I cried in secret. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would kneel and beg God to take that pain away from me. I asked for a sign, an answer, something that would give me the strength to go on. But heaven seemed deaf. The divine silence was as agonizing as my own. Daniel kept trying to get closer, in a discreet and respectful way. On some occasions, he would just sit near me without saying a word, as if trying to remind me that I wasn't alone, even when I felt completely isolated. Somehow, that brought me a small sense of relief, but I still didn't have the courage to open my heart. The fear of breaking the silence, of facing the consequences, was greater than any desire for freedom. I didn't know how much longer I could endure it. The emotional and spiritual prison was suffocating me more and more. And within me, a dangerous seed began to grow. The idea that maybe the only way out was to disappear for good. Because living like that wasn't living anymore. It was just surviving, one day after another, without hope, without a voice, without a soul. The days passed, and the weight of silence continued to crush me. I no longer knew who I was. The weary expression, the lost look, and the tired soul were marks that not even religious masks could hide. But in the middle of each suffocating breath, something unexpected happened. Something I could never have predicted, and that changed the course of everything. On a Sunday morning, the church was shaken by news that spread like an uncontrollable wildfire. During the community breakfast, someone arrived in a frenzy, holding a copy of the local newspaper. Its pages featured an anonymous denunciation, serious accusations against Pastor Roberto. The article spoke of spiritual abuse, emotional manipulation, and private meetings with young girls from the church. The anonymous letter described in detail situations that made my blood run cold. Every word seemed to come straight from my mind. It was as if someone had turned my torment into ink on paper. It didn't take much for me to know who had written it. Julia. It had to be her. That sad look and those stifled words she never managed to say aloud had finally found a way out. She didn't have the courage to speak inside the church, but she spoke. Even without a face, without a name, without a direct voice. The reaction was immediate. A wave of murmurs and outrage spread through the room. People began whispering, their looks filled with anger and contempt, not against the pastor, but against whoever dared to accuse him. The pulpit became a battlefield. That night during the service, Pastor Roberto himself, with tears in his eyes, said it was an attack from the enemy, a plot to weaken God's work. People applauded. They cried. They stood together in collective prayer, asking for protection against the devil's uprising. I was there, sitting, listening to everything, swallowing my despair. Every word struck me like a blow. It was an upside-down world. The wolf in sheep's clothing being defended passionately, while the wounded sheep were called tools of the devil. In the following days, the church became an even more hostile place. Fiery sermons, speeches against jealousy, rebellion, and lack of reverence. Any young person who seemed discouraged was reprimanded. The women gossiped among themselves, outraged by ungrateful people who couldn't recognize the man of God we had. I never saw Julia again. I tried to text her, call her, searched for her discreetly, but her number was disconnected. I went to her house, but her mother just said, without many details, that she had traveled to stay with distant relatives for a while. The uncomfortable look in her mother's eyes said far more than her words. She knew. But, like all of us, she chose silence. The days turned into weeks, and Julia's disappearance became a ghost in my mind. Until, one afternoon, unexpectedly, an anonymous envelope reached me. Inside was a short letter, handwritten in a script I recognized instantly. Laurie, I had to leave. I was scared. He knows everything. He came after me, threatened me, subtly, but I got the message. I couldn't stay any longer. I'm going far away. Don't tell anyone. Take care of yourself. You're strong, even when you think you're not. I love you. My hands trembled. My heart felt like it was about to explode. The threats weren't explicit, but the message was clear. She had to run to protect her life. And I knew. If he had done this to her, what could he do to me? I fell into despair. I spent nights without sleep, afraid of every shadow, every unknown call. I even feared that he might show up at my door, that he might try to silence me somehow. Fear took over my mind and body. I started looking over my shoulder on the street, avoided crowded places, and walked past strangers without making eye contact. At home, the situation got worse. My mother spoke with outrage about the cowardice of someone spreading false accusations against the pastor. These things only show that the devil is furious because the work here is strong, she would say, fervently, unaware of the pain consuming me. I wanted to scream, to tell everything, to pour out what was killing me more and more each day. But fear kept me silent. And then, for the first time, I seriously considered running away too. I couldn't see a way out anymore. Staying there meant suffocating to death. But running seemed like both relief and terror. Where would I go? With what resources? And most of all, how could I carry the weight of abandoning everything I knew and live with the guilt of leaving my family and my faith behind? The nights had become a battlefield inside my mind. I rehearsed my escape over and over. I thought about taking the little money I had saved, disappearing, vanishing from the map, just like Julia. But at the same time, I imagined my mother's disappointed eyes, my family's shame, the cruel judgment of the community. The fear of being discovered, of being followed, of having nowhere to go, paralyzed me. But deep down, I knew that if I stayed, I wouldn't last much longer. The silence was no longer just a weight. It was a prison where I could barely breathe. I carried guilt, fear, shame, and above all, the feeling of being completely alone. The looks in church seemed to pierce through my skin, and the words during services sounded like hammers pounding against a cracked wall about to collapse. Every day, I felt like I was getting closer to that collapse. I couldn't pray anymore. What once came naturally had become impossible. The words wouldn't come, and when I tried, only tears would flow. I would kneel, stare at the ceiling of my room, and silently ask if God was there. I asked why He had allowed all of this. I asked if I had any worth or if I was just a disposable tool in the wrong hands. But heaven remained silent. The nights were long and suffocating. Dark thoughts became constant. I thought of death not as an end, but as rest. I wanted absolute silence. I wanted peace. I wanted to disappear, to erase my existence like blowing out a candle on the verge of burning out. On that particular night, the despair overflowed. Alone in my room, with the lights off and my heart in knots, I made the decision I had been rehearsing for months. I grabbed a handful of sleeping pills my mother used, lay down on the bed, and with hot tears streaming down my face, brought them to my mouth. I just wanted it all to end. I had no strength left to fight. I was tired of carrying a weight that had become unbearable. But just as the tears blurred my vision and the bitter taste spread across my tongue, my phone vibrated. A persistent ring. It was Daniel. I didn't answer. But he called again. And again. And again. Until, almost by reflex, I picked up the phone with trembling hands and answered. I couldn't say a word. I just cried. On the other end of the line, I heard his soft, concerned voice gently say my name. Larissa, where are you? What's happening? The only answer I could give was a deep sob, a choked cry. He understood. Within minutes, he was at my door. I came down, shaky, weak, barely able to stand. When he saw me, Daniel didn't ask anything. He just held me firmly, placed me in the car, and drove away. I didn't know where he was taking me. I thought it would be a hospital. But instead, after a few minutes on the road, he stopped in front of a small, simple church. Nothing like what I was used to. There were no giant signs or glowing lights. Just an open door and warm, inviting lights. Inside, I found something I had never felt before. A light, peaceful atmosphere. There were no shouts, no pressure. Just a small group of people sitting in silence. Some praying softly, others reading the Bible with serenity. Daniel led me to a woman with graying hair and a warm smile. She looked at me as if she could see right through me. A gaze without judgment. Only compassion. I'm Helena, she said calmly. You're safe here. And for the first time in a long time I believed it. Helena took me to a small room next door and let me cry. She said nothing. She just held my hands and let me release everything I had kept inside. The crying lasted minutes that felt like hours. When the tears dried up, there was only a painful emptiness left. I felt exhausted, but at the same time, slightly relieved, for finally not having to pretend. Then she spoke. You are not guilty, Larissa. You were the victim of spiritual abuse. This isn't from God. God doesn't hurt. God doesn't confuse. God sets free. Those words hit something deep inside me. Something broke, a wall, a prison, an invisible chain that had held me for so long. For the first time, I heard someone say it plainly, without sugarcoating it, without putting the weight of responsibility on me. I wasn't guilty. But the internal conflict was immediate. My head screamed with the voices I had carried for years. Do not question the anointed. Be obedient. God tests his chosen. The enemy brings confusion. Helena looked at me and, as if reading my thoughts, said firmly, True faith never imprisons. True faith doesn't chain your heart. Faith sets you free. Larissa. God doesn't use people to hurt others. Those who hurt, manipulate, or abuse are not speaking in God's name. They're speaking in the name of their own ego. And you don't have to carry that weight anymore. I cried again. I cried hard. For the first time, those words entered my heart and made sense. The conflict inside me was immense. Part of me wanted to believe, wanted to be free. But another part, conditioned for years, felt afraid, guilty, doubtful. Helena was patient. She didn't try to rush the process. She hugged me, listened to me, and told me I didn't have to solve everything right then. That healing would be a long road. But it was possible. Daniel stayed close by, without pressuring me. His presence was discreet but constant. A silent safe haven. That night, I left that place different. Broken but somehow hopeful. For the first time, I thought about the possibility of starting over, of not carrying that burden alone anymore. The next day, I returned to that little church. Helena welcomed me again and introduced me to a Christian psychologist who worked with victims of spiritual and emotional abuse. I accepted the help, afraid, but with just enough courage to take the first step. The first sessions were painful. Talking about everything was like reliving the trauma. But little by little, I began to understand that the guilt wasn't mine. That I had been manipulated, deceived, used by someone who hid behind a title. Helena and Daniel stood by my side through the entire process. With every setback, every doubt, every fear, they were there. Slowly, the faith I thought I had lost began to rebuild. Not a faith based on fear and blind obedience anymore, but a light, genuine faith, rooted in grace and freedom. It was the beginning of my liberation. A painful road, yes, but finally, a road leading me away from chains and toward truth. The days that followed were marked by an intense process of rebuilding. With every meeting with Pastor Helena and every therapy session with the psychologist, I found myself shedding, layer by layer, the suffocating armor I had worn for so many years. I cried. I relived the pain. But I also began to breathe air I never knew existed, the air of freedom. Still, true liberation required something greater. It wasn't enough to heal in silence. There was a world out there full of other girls and women trapped in the same chains that once suffocated me. I knew Pastor Roberto was still in his pulpit, smiling, preaching, manipulating. The same man who had destroyed my soul continued to be exalted. I couldn't live with that anymore. And that's when the urge to confront began to grow inside me. A true calling, unlike the one he had imposed on me. A calling for truth. Helena noticed it before I even said it out loud. One quiet afternoon, as we sipped tea after a prayer, she looked at me sweetly and said, "Larissa, when you're ready, your voice can set others free. But only do it when your heart tells you it's time." That night, after much thought, I was sure. The fear still gripped my chest, my hands trembled, but I knew I could no longer stay silent. Daniel and Helena supported me through every detail. They were the ones who suggested I record a video, telling my story. Raw, unfiltered. Not a rehearsed speech. Not a cold accusation. But the truth, spoken from the heart, with the pain it carried. At first, just the thought of turning on the camera made my stomach turn. I was afraid of judgment, of exposure, of threats. But the image of so many girls still trapped in that prison pushed me forward. That night, Helena welcomed me into her home, a warm and safe space. We sat on her living room couch, with Daniel adjusting the phone on a tripod. Neither of them told me what to say. They just looked at me with kindness, silent, giving me strength. The video began with my trembling voice. My name is Larissa Mendez. For years, I was a prisoner of a religious system that, instead of protecting me, wounded me deeply. I was abused, not just spiritually, but emotionally and physically. By someone who was supposed to be a role model. By someone the world calls a man of God. And today, I no longer speak just for myself. I speak for all the other girls and women who are still silenced, carrying guilt that is not theirs. The tears came naturally, but I didn't edit them out. I told it all. From beginning to end. The manipulative compliments, the private prayers, the physical abuse disguised as deliverance, the mental prison that held me for years. I shared the despair, the suicide attempt, and finally the beginning of my freedom. When I finished, the room was filled with a heavy silence. Helena hugged me tightly. Daniel moved, held my hand. They knew the magnitude of the step I had taken. The next morning, with both of their blessings, the video was published. Within hours, it began gaining traction. At first, slowly, a few likes, a few shares. But by nightfall, the video had gone viral. I stared at my phone screen, unable to believe what was happening. Messages began pouring in. Hundreds, then thousands. Some were supportive, words of strength, women thanking me for having the courage to say what they couldn't. Others, as expected, were filled with hate. Accusations of lying, attacks saying I was a tool of the enemy trying to destroy the church. But amid the chaos, something powerful began to happen. Other victims began to come forward. That's how I met Carolina. She sent me a long, painful message telling her story. A story almost identical to mine, but from years earlier. She had also suffered at the hands of Pastor Roberto. She had remained silent out of fear, shame, and mostly because there had been no one who believed her. When we met for the first time, Carolina was trembling. She sat across from me, tears in her eyes, and said, "When I saw your video, it felt like someone had ripped the gag off my mouth." Her voice was weak, but full of truth. I thought I'd gone crazy. That it was my fault. But now I know it wasn't. We became sisters in pain and in strength. Together, we began receiving more and more stories. Young girls, adult women, even some elderly, sharing similar experiences. All of them silenced for years, afraid to face the massive structure of the church and the power of that man. The church's reaction was brutal. As soon as the video began to spread and more accusations surfaced, the leadership tried to suppress it. They claimed it was a coordinated attack from the enemy to destroy God's work. Fiery sermons took over the services, turning the pulpit into a battleground against slanderers and sowers of discord. But the pressure kept growing. Local media began reporting on the case, at first cautiously, only mentioning anonymous accusations against a religious leader. In no time, reporters began searching for more victims. Newspapers printed headlines with words I never thought I'd see. Spiritual abuse. Victims break the silence and expose religious leader. The church tried to deny it. They threatened lawsuits. They used social media to defend the pastor's honor. They organized vigils asking for protection from what they called demonic persecution. But this time, there was no hiding. The truth had come out of the shadows, and the power of unity was stronger than any structure built on lies. Yes, I was afraid. I received anonymous threats, cruel messages, looks of disdain from people who once called me blessed. But in the midst of all that, there was peace. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of that pain alone. And most importantly, I knew. The silence that had imprisoned me for years was broken. The truth had found its voice. And it was stronger than any fear. When the first formal reports reached the authorities, I knew there was no turning back. It was no longer just a viral video or anonymous stories. It had become an official legal case. Pastor Roberto's name, once untouchable and respected, was now under public investigation. Within days, the news spread like wildfire, appearing in national news portals, on TV, and in talk shows. The preventive arrest came quickly. One morning, images of the pastor being taken away by police, still in his suit, Bible in hand, with a serious face, were shown on every screen. The local church turned into a whirlwind of chaos. Weeping churchgoers, some crying out injustice, others quiet, shaken, their faith disturbed. Outside, Reporters scrambled for more details about the scandal, which had now become a matter of public interest. The trial promised to be long and painful, and it was. At every hearing the press was there. With every new victim who stepped forward to testify, faces grew more shocked. What had once been whispered became a shout. I knew my life would never be the same, but I also knew this fight wasn't just mine. It was for everyone who, like me, carried invisible scars and silent fears. The attack started as soon as my face appeared on the news. Social media turned into a war zone. On one side were women and men supporting me, sending messages of strength, telling me I had given a voice to thousands of suffocated silences. On the other side were those calling me a liar, a fraud, a tool of the devil. The threats came in anonymous messages, violent comments, even phone calls with disguised voices telling me to shut up before it's too late. I was afraid. Many times I thought about giving up, backing away, hiding. But every time that thought came, I received a message of support, a story, an anonymous letter from someone saying, "You saved me." And that kept me going. The heaviest blow, though, didn't come from strangers. It came from home. When my mother found out the magnitude of the scandal and my involvement, she reacted with shock and anger. At first, she looked at me with contempt. She said words I will never forget. "You've destroyed God's work. I can't believe you had the nerve to bear false witness against Pastor Roberto. You're a disgrace." Those words hurt more than any threat. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at home became unbearable. My mother avoided me, prayed aloud asking for mercy, cried as she said her daughter had been used by the enemy. My father, as always, remained silent, hidden behind his coldness, incapable of saying anything at all. But time and truth have a power of their own. As the trial progressed, evidence came forward. Strong testimonies, documents, saved messages, stories from girls who had endured the same spiritual prison. And then, the final blow. Julia reappeared. I never imagined I'd see her again. But there she was, standing in court, having returned from the other side of the world. She had fled to rebuild her life, but when she heard the trial was happening, she came back. She faced the fear, the threats, the past. Her presence was a shock to everyone. When she took the stand and told her story, her voice trembling, the courtroom went silent. The confirmation of what had once been treated as mere doubt was now undeniable. After Julia's testimony, my mother had nothing left to say. One quiet night, she came into my room. Her eyes were red and swollen. She sat on the edge of my bed and, for the first time in a long time, held my hand. "Laurie, forgive me. I was wrong. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just couldn't accept it. I taught you to trust blindly, and you paid the price for it. I'm sorry I didn't see. I'm sorry I didn't protect you." I cried. She cried. We held each other. It wasn't a comforting hug. It was a hug of reconciliation, filled with pain, regret, and the beginning of understanding. The hearings continued, and with each one, the scandal grew. The cost of truth was high. I lost friendships. I lost the perfect daughter image my family and the church had built. But I gained something greater. My freedom, my voice, and the certainty that no matter how painful it was, I was on the right side of history. The trial ended, and the verdict was delivered. Pastor Roberto was found guilty of multiple crimes, including religious abuse of power, emotional manipulation, and physical abuse. His once untouchable and revered image fell before a truth that could no longer be silenced. He was taken to prison, and during the sentencing, I watched that man, the one I once called a man of God, look around not with remorse, but with arrogance and indignation. Still, I knew in that moment, he no longer had power over me. But his conviction didn't mean the end of my battle. The legal process had concluded, but the healing process was only beginning. The trauma, the pain, the fear. It was all still inside me, like open wounds that needed time, care, and above all, love to heal. With the support of Helena and Daniel, I began to understand that my mission didn't end there. God hadn't allowed me to survive all of that so I could stay silent again. I realized little by little that my voice could save other lives, could prevent other girls and women from going through the same prison I had. That's how, with a still fragile heart, I began to accept invitations to speak. At first it was hard. My voice shook, my hands sweated, and every word came with tears. But with each testimony, each emotional face before me, I felt God's presence strengthening me. In every church, school, or community I visited, there was someone who needed to hear what I had to say. Someone carrying a similar burden, who needed to know they weren't alone, that true faith doesn't imprison, it sets you free. Daniel stood by my side every step of the way. Our relationship, born out of friendship and respect, blossomed into something even more beautiful. There was no rush, no pressure. Just two hearts rebuilding together, sustained by faith and the certainty that God doesn't place heavy burdens on the shoulders of those he loves, but offers rest and relief. He was patient with my pain, present in my silences, and celebrated each small victory of mine as if it were his own. Julia also returned to my life for good. Together, we understood that what we had lived through couldn't remain only as the memory of a courtroom. There was much more to be done. So we decided to found an NGO dedicated to supporting victims of spiritual and emotional abuse. A safe space where women and men could find care, psychological guidance, legal support, and above all, a place to be heard without judgment. We named the organization Free Voices, because we understood that liberation begins the moment a voice finds the courage to break the silence. Little by little, that seed grew. We began receiving stories from all over the country. Painful and transformative testimonies. In every talk I gave, I shared not only the pain, but the journey of overcoming. I showed that the weight of the past doesn't have to determine the future. That God does not condone abuse or manipulation. That the true Christ is the one who embraces, who heals, who restores. The churches that once criticized me were now inviting me. Some leaders who had turned their backs on me in the past were now asking for forgiveness, admitting that turning a blind eye had been their greatest mistake. And I forgave, because I understood that to forgive is to finally be free. In one of the last talks of the year, standing before an auditorium full of young people, mothers, and leaders, I ended my testimony with tears in my eyes and a steady voice. Faith sets you free. It doesn't imprison. God never uses anyone to harm another. Where there is manipulation and abuse, the Holy Spirit is not present. Do not stay silent. Do not accept chains disguised as blessings. God wants us free. And the truth transforms lives. The auditorium erupted in applause and tears. I cried, they cried, and in that moment, I felt a deep peace. A cycle had closed. My mother was in the audience. At the end, she came up to the stage and hugged me, tearfully whispering, "You are stronger than I ever imagined, my daughter. God did choose you, but to set people free, not to suffer." I smiled, tears running down my face, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like everything finally made sense. The journey continues. There are still many trapped voices, many silenced stories. But now I know that my purpose is greater than my pain. It is to transform, to inspire, and to bring light where there is darkness. Truth, no matter how painful, heals. And true faith teaches us that God will never allow lies to prevail when there are hearts willing to fight. Today, when I look back, I no longer see the frightened girl bound by invisible chains. I see a woman who is free, healed, at peace, and with the unshakable certainty that truth transforms lives, beginning with mine.